racial hierarchy, and protest against an iteration of the faith that was defined by this worldly assemblages like greed and power. Though often unrecognized, an additional motivating factor that attended these more commonly acknowledged reasons for protest is the issue of religious freedom. C. Eric Lincoln and Lawrence Mamiya make the compelling case that, quote, from the very beginning of the Black experience in America, one critical denotation of freedom has remained constant. Freedom has always meant the absence of any restraint which might compromise one's responsibility to God, end quote. So what distinctives mark these communities? I'll name a few. An understanding of Christian being and practice devoid of access to the levers of state power. It's very important. The church, by necessity, becomes adjusted to the fact that their practice of Christianity has to be one that is able to thrive without having access to the levers of state power. It is a subaltern Christian sociality that knows how to exist at the margins, and therefore the sociality has baked into it common good concerns, communally oriented love ethics. Another thing that marks these communities is something that we might call a critical patriotism that hasn't been wooed by the temptation to subject Christianity to the task of serving as custodian of national mythology. We can say more about that, but because of an experience that lied at the underside of the American experiment, the temptation to put one's faith in service to upholding national mythology was not a temptation that these communities felt. They were too well acquainted with the underside of American geopolitical life. To quote James Baldwin, "I love America more than any other country in the world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." So you have this critical patriotism, or what we might call a critical patriotism, that goes back as early as the 18th century with early Black religious writers, Phillis Wheatley being one of them. So let me now move on to this idea of fugitivity that is emerging out of both this historical genealogy that I have attempted to summarize, but then also just my own experiential reckoning with some of these realities in contemporary life. On Black fugitivity. I view the formation of Black church life, from the secret hush harbors to the founding of denominations, as a kind of fugitive practice. The concept of fugitivity has its roots in Black studies, reflecting on, most specifically, the experience of fugitive slaves, like Frederick Douglass, for example. Not as a singular act of resistance, but as a way of life defined not merely by acts of flight or escape, but by a disposition of disavowal, of refusal of that which has been deemed erroneous. So here I'm in conversation with someone like Fred Moten, who's a Black studies scholar who draws on and helps define this idea of fugitivity. He puts it this way, quote, "It is a desire for and a spirit of escape and transgression of that which is proper and proposed. It's a desire for the outside, for a playing or being outside, an outlaw edge proper to the now always and already improper voice or instrument." So he's playing a little bit with musical words. But it's this willingness and desire for the outside, for the margin. It's making choice of that positionality. I want to transfer that theory or port that theory into this Christian discourse and argue for a kind of Christian fugitivity, meaning this: when the predominating standards of what might be considered orthodoxy, dictated by popular iterations of American Christianity, prove to be perhaps counterfeit, most acutely seen and felt in socio-political discourse, for example, then Christians need not subject themselves to them. Fugitivity, then, is a willful unlawfulness, a kind of criminality, or in the words of scholar J. Cameron Carter, a malpractice. But notice the play on words here. It is unlawful only in the sense that that which is considered lawful has been deemed illegitimate. So the thing that is considered lawful has been deemed illegitimate, but up against that standard, your practice is considered unlawful. It is criminal only in the sense that that which is legal is illegitimately issuing the charge of criminality. Or to use language germane to Christian discourse, fugitive Christian practice is often read as, or might be read as, heretical only in the sense that that which is considered orthodox or normative is illegitimately issuing the charge of heresy. Christian fugitivity chooses to, quote unquote, go heretic, and this is important, for the sake of actually pursuing true orthodoxy. In other words, fugitivity is not pursuit of the heretical for the sake of being heretical. It is not contrarian or a contrarian mode of existence for the sake of being contrarian, nor is it necessarily deconstruction. Rather, it is the recognized necessity of taking the outside for the sake of deep concern for the inside. It is a project of refusal that has as its end the goal of recovery. A couple of thoughts on a fugitive political imagination. A fugitive political imagination takes as its starting point a disavowal of the binary constraints that constitute our present socio-political age. By disavowal, I do not mean to disallow or prohibit, for example, political party affiliation and activity. Let me go ahead and say that before you stop listening. But what it does mean is a refusal to allow one's Christian identity to become conflated with and or totalizingly defined by said party affiliation. It's a refusal of those terms of negotiation. Form-fitting Christianity to the contours of Democratic or Republican Party platforms does damage to both the witness of the faith itself, and it does not serve one's politics of choice in the end. The other day I was playing with my son, and it was a joke to me, my 9-year-old son, Jude, and I immediately regretted it, but we were just kind of joking around, and I put on one of his shirts. I was just kind of, I'm gonna wear your shirt, I'm gonna try it on. It was one of his favorite shirts though, it was a Minecraft shirt. And of course, when I put it on, right, like, I stretched it, like, I did damage to the shirt, and the shirt didn't make me look good at all. That's what it looks like when a Christian tries to form fit their Christian witness into a political party, right? You look like someone wearing, like, it was like a medium, and I'm like an extra large, right? Currently, the choices that stand before us demand us to either jettison biblical and theological convictions on the one hand, or pay an intentional inattention to issues of justice and the common good on the other hand. A fugitive political imagination leans into the unsettling nature of fugitive life, right? So again, I'm drawing on that kind of idea of fugitivity, and you can look at someone like Frederick Douglass as a perfect example of this, right? Frederick Douglass escapes slavery in the South, he flees to the North, but it's not a fugitive existence that he's always hiding, right? No, it is a very visible fugitive existence. Frederick Douglass becomes arguably the most photographed man in the 19th century, and he's a fugitive, right? If I escape, I'm hiding everywhere. You're not gonna see me ever again. Frederick Douglass is sitting for photos, just, posing for people as a fugitive, right? But what is he doing? He's publicly performing his disavowal and disapproval of the ethical code that's structuring his life, right? He's making a public display of an alternative or an ulterior, an alternative kind of way of living. And he's performing that out loud. So a fugitive political imagination leans into the unsettling nature of fugitive life. This never not feeling at homeness that perhaps characterizes the status of many Christians in our current moment when you think about the state of politics, right? That unsettled, I don't feel like I fit somewhere, right? What I'm suggesting is that kind of fugitivity mode of being leans into that feeling, right? And I would say that we have sufficient biblical and theological resources that undergird that, right? The language of sojourner and stranger, right? So again, part of the gaslighting, right, or part of the self-deception that I'm interrogating, right, is this idea or assumption that I should feel at home in a system and a structure where my sacred text is telling me if I'm doing it right, I won't feel at home, right? So I'm trying to place us more in line with what the text is suggesting the Christian life will, or what we should expect from the Christian life. But such sounds like a rather lonely road, an isolating road. In one sense, it is, if the sole frame of reference is the current status quo of American political and civic life. But what makes the fugitivity I'm suggesting distinctly Christian is not only the commitment to those first-order theological principles that demarcate people of the way, but a profound commitment to that people as the site for authentic Christian community. A fugitive practice in community with others committed to the same kind of fugitivity, right? This is the kind of sociality that I'm suggesting. It's the only way it works. That there's that common shared commitment to that kind of marginal status, that status as those who are trying to image an alternative way of living, right? But that shared communal commitment has to be present for that sociality to work. I want to turn to another passage of scripture as I close out these comments. Ephesians chapter 5, familiar passage of scripture. Ephesians chapter 5, beginning at verse 13, or rather Galatians chapter 5, beginning at verse 13. For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. And this is the concern that kind of motivated me down this path of kind of theoretically thinking this through, right? The biting and the devouring that Paul is referencing here. Now, obviously, this is a ecclesiologically rooted and contextual concern that he's relating here about particular yokes of law abiding that have been imposed on some in the community, right? And he's saying, wait a minute, in Christ you've been made free, so don't try to bind other individuals like that. It undermines the freedom that you've been granted, right? He says, when you put those kinds of restrictions and constraints on individuals, it's the equivalent of biting and devouring one another, right? And as I thought about my own experience in political life, in recent years, and even today, that biting and devouring, particularly when I'm looking at certain Christian communities, that kind of defines what's going on. And in many ways, what I'm suggesting here, this kind of alternative way of being in the world for a Christian life, I'm trying to prevent us eating each other up again as this next election cycle emerges, right? I don't think Christianity in America can survive doing that again. Like I don't think that it can sustain itself if it's just going to be a rehearsal of what we all went through, right? So I'm suggesting a kind of alternative way of being and existing, right? In order to prevent that. But it takes that shared commitment to that communal ethic, and this communal ethic I'm calling fugitivity. But ultimately, what I'm theorizing, what I'm trying to theorize, is again what the scriptures often refer to us as strangers and sojourners, right? Trying to be faithful here in a place that's not ultimately our home, and trying to adhere to the mandate that our Lord has given us. I'm trying to theorize that in ways that perhaps make sense, that might sound compelling with this language. But ultimately, I just want us to be more like Jesus. All right, that's it. That's it.
There is plenty of time for questions. I think our crowd is small. You can probably moderate.
Yeah, absolutely. Any concerns? I disagree. You're free to say that too. I don't want to be a fugitive. All right. Yes, sir.
Let's throw the classical problem, right? In terms of your own activism, the notion of embracing one's outsiderness. benefits of avoiding power versus the need to act just. So it's a classical problem. How would you negotiate that problem?
Yeah.
Opting out, but also making a difference.
Sure. I mean, this is why I root my consideration of this idea, right, in the experience of the Black church, right? Like at its best, I think we see a tradition that has demonstrated a way to be effective, even as it does not have at its kind of immediate access the levers of state power. So what does that mean, right? It means a particular kind of activism, influence, a particular commitment to a kind of visibility, right? You look at, if you're going to kind of home in on the civil rights movement as one site of this, right? What does it mean for a community to understand that the social structures are such that I'm going to intentionally incite a display of the racial hierarchy because I know it's going to be put on national TV, right? So I'm gonna create the conditions whereby I'm just showing up. But I know that in showing up, and King referred to it as this way, it's kind of putting on a dramatic play, right? As a kind of creative way for a community that sits at the margins to insert themselves into the kind of national discourse, right? Just as one example, right? So it's you then communally considering what ways from the margins are we able to perhaps make our impact, or make our interrogation, make our intervention rather, make our critique, right? And for me, it kind of makes sense that it would take place from the margins, right? Like if I'm thinking about the scriptures, if I'm thinking about Christian living, if I'm thinking about the kinds of structures and systems that we might be critical of, yes, there's helpful work to be done from inside of them, but it just makes sense that that kind of outsiderness will be the site from which that kind of critique is levied, right? But again, it's a tougher road, right? It's a commitment to a tougher road. Which is why it's not to be done in isolation. It's a communal effort. It's communal existence, and ultimately, what I would point you back to as having is the power of the Holy Spirit, right? I don't have state power. I don't have the levers of governmental power. I have a different kind of power. It's an otherworldly power, right? But no, that is part of the question and the tension, right? Yep.
So it seems like you're kind of inviting more Christians to live in a sort of like Black fugitivity. How do people who were on the inside pushing Black people to the outside, how do they come to the outside and unite well? How do we do that well?
Yeah. No, I mean this is why I think relationship is important, community is important, right? And this is why the journey is important. You're right. I like the way you even put that. It's an invitation into a contextually kind of located mode of existence that I'm kind of opening up for a kind of broader invitation, right? So the Blackness in Black fugitivity is not like exclusively then Black in a literal sense, but it's emerging from that context and it's kind of opening up, right? And again, you can point to something like the Civil Rights Movement is kind of demonstrating this, right? The kind of broad, even thinking broad religious tradition engagement in that movement, right? It's kind of opening up availability and space to be co-laborers, right? And so I would suggest even the same. And you saw these kinds of transitions even in that movement, right? From folks who were on the inside, operating in particular kinds of ways, transitioning to linking arms with those at the margins, right? And that's the kind of journey that I think we have to allow for, right? And that happens via relationship, via communally invested relationship. And again, it dovetails quite nicely with the very language that we espouse as Christians: language of forgiveness, language of repentance, language of repair, right? Like all these resources we have to kind of affect that kind of communal change. But you're right, it's an important step. I saw a hand over here.
Yeah, I just had a question, kind of following up on that.
Yeah.
You had talked about going heretic or something along those lines. I mean, this journey from the center, if you think about it as moving toward this outlaw fugitive sort of status, what happens, it seems, is like as soon as you start making that move, you are deemed heretic. And I guess my curiosity is like, if this is successful, then there's nothing there, and that church that church is empty, and everybody moves back out to Martin's. And so this sort of question is like, how does the church, I mean, this is a version of that same question, how do we negotiate that movement?
Yeah.
Without, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Without the
yeah.
total collapse.
Yeah,
I
no,
don't
no.
know if there's a kind of collapse.
Of course.
you want, but like that's like a huge problematic, especially as you were to find out the church every time you move toward this fugitive fringe.
I mean, and this is the language. I mean, you literally see this language, and we don't have to kind of orient around the 20th century. You see this language earlier than that. White individuals and white communities who are becoming abolitionists and are being deemed heretics by their church community, right? What does that experience mean? So in many ways, it is a leveling of a very serious critique of what's at the center, and calling, kind of like John's revelation language of Jesus to the churches, right? Like calling for a return to, right? A first love, a return to. And this is a problem that I suggest has kind of plagued particularly the American church from the first, right? It's an old historical problem. You can kind of push it back further than that. I mentioned some things in the 4th century, but it's a dated problem that has kind of marked the upper side of American Christianity. And in many ways, some of the fracturing that we're seeing is a kind of forced reckoning with that. I call it kind of gaslighting, right? It's being called to account. Like, y'all have been gaslighting us, and everybody's calling it out. Even non-Christians are like, I'm not even a Christian, but I know that ain't Christianity, right? Like, isn't that what's happening, right? They're like, I'm not even a part of that, but I know that ain't it, right? So this kind of forced reckoning in this moment, which I'm trying to frame as a kind of invitation, right? One of the things that was exposed, and I didn't mention it here, but if you think of like King's language of the beloved community, in many ways, I think he's describing what you want to see in the interior of the church, right? He has this vision for like a broader beloved community, but in many ways, what he's describing is what was supposed to be the Christian community. And in a moment of kind of national crisis, right, which I still think we're kind of in, the church, the American church, was shown to be unprepared to meet the challenge of the moment, right? Like, outside of the church, stuff was collapsing, and you had people trying to reckon with history in ways that were unhealthy, and that was like a prime moment for the church to be like, okay, we got this message, we got this, like, and the church was kind of shown to not be ready, right? To not even be on one accord, to not even have the resources to respond to the moment, and then some spaces not wanting to respond to the moment, right? And so it is a kind of invitation for this kind of spiritual reckoning that I think is always initiated by individuals making the conscious choice to exist in a different kind of mode. But you're right. It is. I'm not calling for the utter collapse of these kind of institutions and spaces, but I am calling for a radical reimagining of what it is that we're doing. Right? And asking, is it consistent with what we see, an ecclesiology that we see in the New Testament? Right? At least I want to see communities pose that question to themselves. Anybody else? Yep.
How do you see this concept of fugitivity connecting to interdenominational relations?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. One of the things that, and I've often said it this way, a lot of these conversations about doctrinal distinctives, theological distinctives, differences in these things matter. What I didn't appreciate is how, when you're in an environment where like everything is a big deal and everything is something to fight about, then it's hard to see those things that like actually are truly worthy of discussion and debate, right? So one of the things that I'm suggesting with this sense of fugitivity, right, is this kind of disavowal of, and this is going to be important, I think, for the season that we're approaching, of so easily being incited to fear and rage about things that on the pecking order really aren't that serious, right? Seminary president, where I took my first master's, Al Mohler, he has this construct he calls theological triage. And he's kind of drawing on this language, this French word, language that we see in hospitals where they try to discern what level of importance does a patient coming through the ER, how do I rank that, right? If somebody comes in with a gunshot wound, that needs to be treated more severely than someone who comes in, like I came in one day and I was like cutting something and I sliced my finger. And I like ran through the door like, this is so bad. And they were like, sir, you need to have a seat. Literally, hand bloody, napkin all bloody. They're like, seats are right over there. So I sat there for a couple hours, right? I was triaged. It's important, but it's not that important. And that's his kind of way of saying, right, there are first order issues of theological importance that rank among the highest of importance, second order, third order, right? And what you put in those rankings might differ, but we need to regulate our emotions, right? That's the most base way to put it. I work and operate in DC, and so because I was kind of in the center of like political election life and I was a public policy advocate, I would get all these emails, asking for money, but a lot of them would be like, be afraid, be very afraid. These are Christian organizations. Like, you need to be scared. They are coming for your kids. And I'm like, who's coming for Jude? Right? But like this, like drawing on this language of fear and panic, like the church needs to not give itself over to that so easily, right? There are things of deep importance and concern, but we need to regulate that. Especially if we're all drawing on the sacred text that very often says, do not fear. I mean, literally, like, don't be afraid. But you often see, right, like this kind of collective investment in more everything. It's just, and I think in this moment, part of what I'm talking about is a kind of politics of disposition, of refusal of that. And many of you have often seen it, right? Like, you've often perhaps played that role when somebody comes to you like outraged, and they're like, why aren't you upset? You're like, I mean, it's important, but I mean, I'm tired, right? You often seen how that kind of negotiation incites even more kind of, right? Like, it's like, why aren't you as mad as I am about what they're about to do? It's like, well, I mean, we can pray about it, and ultimately the Lord will. It's right. It's just this very different response. I'm calling us to lean into that, and again, it can be a painful process relationally, but you are demonstrating an alternative. You are leaning into that alternative practice, and so to the issues of like interdenominational and relationships and all those things. I think that what I'm suggesting is a disavowal of a kind of boundary watching, boundary concerning way of Christian living that doesn't, I think, truly reflect the capacity of the kingdom of God as we're all seeking to, well, I use Pauline language again, as we all are seeing through a glass dimly, right? And that's not to belittle theological and doctrinal distinctives of concern, but it is to suggest that there ought to be a kind of ranking with how we respond in a given moment. Is that kind of helpful? Yeah. Yep.
So, where would you say that we should draw the line between seeking to live together despite our differences and separating in order to live according to our convictions?
Yeah, no, that's and so to that point, I think that on some things we are at an impasse, right? On some things we are I want to be able to clearly see what those are. I don't want that conversation to be enveloped by a bunch of things that aren't impasses. So to answer your question, I absolutely think there are some differences. I mean, I've been in a number of different theological settings trying to maintain a solid theological rudder. There are some deep differences that mean very kind of stark things. Like we're at an impasse here. The way my theological convictions are set up, people kind of say the way my bank account is set up, I don't understand. I'm not there, and therefore I may be unable to participate with you in particular kinds of ways because of my theological convictions, right? But again, even in a moment like, even that's fugitive, right? That way of negotiating and relationally attending to your theological convictions, right? Even there's an alternative way of doing that that I think is healthier than what we've seen. So no, you're absolutely right. I do think that on certain things there is an impasse, and one of the challenges of our current age, you're at a theological institution, so you know this. One of the challenges of our current age is different iterations, it's not just denominationally parsed, but just different iterations, different understandings of the scriptures result in these kind of clashes, right? And communities then are set up that reflect those distinctives, right? I understand that. I'm suggesting that where we don't have to have those barriers up, we should see to it that we don't. So that when we do have them up, we know that it means something and it matters, right? I think that's what's being lost. It's like, because you all are ready to fight about everything, I don't know if anything's really important to you all. I can't see what actually matters in some instances. I want to make those things clear, so that it can at least be interpreted that on this stand, Stephen is trying to stand on certain biblical and theological convictions, not a political ideology, right? Not something else. So does that kind of a little bit? Yep.
Okay, I really appreciate.
Are we running out of time? I'm sorry. We good?
No,
Oh, we good.
I'm just asking a question, I'm not sharing. I really appreciate this notion of fugitivity, especially in contrast to the notion of sojourn, which I've sort of felt is a little passive compared to citizen. So fugitivity adds something. What I'm still somewhat unclear on is whether you see fugitivity to be some sort of a theologically necessary position that we need to assume because of the reality of the fall, for example. We just need to go to the margins. Or whether it's something which is prudential, that because of the historical situation, because the situation of slavery was that it's just more prudent to go to the margins and try to make a virtue out of necessity.
Yeah.
You see the difference?
Yeah, of course. I see the latter. I see definitely see the credence in the latter, but I actually think it's the former, right? And that could very well be because of the ways in which I'm formed and shaped communities. I emerged. My spiritual community is a located one in traditional Black church settings, but for me it kind of makes sense, right? You look at how the New Testament Christian community emerges and expands, right? You look at how the gospel expands and spreads. It just seems to be, so I mentioned that point in the 4th century, we can kind of locate other historical markers, right? But it just seems when the church is cozy with power, imperial power, state power, it has a kind of corrupting effect, right? It's a kind, just something is off, right? Justo Gonzalez's History of Christianity it was a 2-volume set when I had it. It's probably a later edition, but he kind of walks through like what some of those differences look like when you saw that kind of relationship affect how the church itself operated. And the kind of critique he's making is, right, you saw this kind of gradual shift in how the church saw itself, its mission. And that language that I used, tethering the success of the advance of the kingdom to the success of state power, right? Like that like relationship is totally, to me, contrary to what Jesus says about his church and how it will advance. But that kind of, and you hear this language now, right? Like the kingdom of God will not be advanced unless that person gets elected. Like whoever I'm pointing to, right? Don't matter, right? It applies for whoever I'm pointing to, right? But to make that kind of construct shouldn't sound right. You know, that the church, I don't know, the church gonna go under if we can't get that person elected. Like, do they go to church? Like that kind of construct just doesn't sound right. Now, I'm suggesting it doesn't sound right because it's not right. Like it's not right. And so in many ways, what I'm suggesting, I think, is dovetails with the narrative and the ethos that we see in the New Testament. At least I'm suggesting that it might be so. Yes, you, and then I'm gonna come here. Sorry, I saw your hand earlier.
With really, when you your illustration, not actually pointed out what Frederick Douglass did in terms of he made known that he was a fugitive. When we see someone like taking part in fugitivity for the sake of maybe something that's changed, how do we then reconcile that with, like, heresy does exist, so how are we, how do we then like take like the gravitas of that decision we have to make? So what is heresy and what is someone from a margin seeing what I can't see because I'm inside?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, which is why I suggest at the very least this is done in community, right? That, you know, when I'm, and this still happens, and I just turned 38. When I'm buttoning up a button down and I'm off, somebody else has to point that out to me. I can never see, I think I'm good. And my wife, Sunny, is like, yeah, you wrong. And I'm like, what? Let me start over, right? It's that's the way the community serves an individual Christian, right? And so I'm not suggesting, because yeah, I think that's part of the real risk, right? I just want to be heretical for the sake of being other, right? I want to be, and that's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting a deep investment and a spiritual consideration in community of what the Lord is calling us to that will hopefully help me stay the course of orthodoxy, even as I'm seeking to, right? But that is a very important challenge because those missions can get mixed, right? Which is why I intentionally suggested, right? Like, I'm not suggesting I'm not even suggesting a kind of deconstruction, right? I just want to kind of rip it apart and see what I have when it's done. I'm like, you've got a mess, that's what you have. I'm suggesting a more consciously thought out, communally invested, Bible open, spirit working kind of process. It's absolutely right. Yep.
Thank you very much. The idea of black fugitivity happens at a time in history, obviously. And it's very much the margins responding to the center. My question now is, can you speak to how the black church is compromised today?
Yeah.
Despite that history, and in danger of probably compromised with its prophetic edge.
Yeah. Yeah, and a longer version of this, and I even had this here, I just didn't go into it, which is why I'm often using this construct, the best of the black church tradition. And what that construct is doing for me is doing this work of intentionally pointing to a thread of this tradition. The black church is a sociological shorthand. There's always been a heterogeneity of black denominational belief and all of these things. But this construct is useful in very particular kinds of ways. So I would say certain segments, certain spaces are more so than others, right? So I want to always make that clear. There are certain denominational spaces, I know for a fact, certain communities in certain parts of the country that are very profoundly invested in maintaining a kind of theological integrity that is consistent with, and you even see that now rising up with certain movements like my friend Justin Giboney runs something called the AND campaign, which is a kind of civic literacy, civic engagement organization that is intentionally drawing out to make public those spaces of black church life that often don't get high visibility, that are actually trying to hold the line on some of these important issues. So what are the risk factors, right? Where are the risks at? It's being swept away by the spirit of the age, right? It says why I began with Romans 12. If I don't have a theological rudder, and I can concretely say it this way, and this perhaps will be helpful here. My passion for justice, how I understand justice, how I understand socially oriented efforts for and toward justice, rooted in a doctrine of God. It's emerging from a particular theological understanding of a God who is just, which is informed by and bracketed by how God defines what is just, what is right, etc., right? That kind of keeps me in a particular kind of lane, so that the things that I'm aiming for, that I'm putting under the heading of justice, are just according to God's justice. They're right according to God's righteousness. They're not defined by categories and ideologies and aims that depart from the faith once for all delivered to the faith, or the faith once for all delivered to the saints, right? That's part of the challenge and the temptation. There is a kind of, I use the civil rights movement as a kind of site of reference here. There is a kind of uh, rights movement imagination that kind of drives certain ecclesiological spaces that is not tethered and rooted to a kind of theological conviction, right? It's just a kind of movement and rights for the sake of movement and rights. What I'm suggesting, again, kind of similar to how I answered my brother here, is a very communally rooted, theologically grounded, spirit-driven kind of focus. So that the things I'm aiming for are actually the things that he would have me aim for, right? And how I'm thinking about justice, how I'm thinking about rights, how I'm thinking about equity, all these things, right? Don't depart from it, they're aligned with my faith. And that's a risk that I think not just extends distinctly and particularly to the Black church, but all churches, right? But particularly with particularly with a group that is very much so invested in a communal memory of being about these things, that risk is definitely prevalent, right? If that's in my that's the historical memory of the space from which I emerged, that's going to be a temptation that I need to be immediately wary of because of the history that I'm drawing on, right? And we see some of those challenges exist today in a number of different ways. So a group like the AND campaign is trying to draw out those Black church spaces that are engaged deeply and profoundly in this kind of work, but emerging from a theological rootedness. And he wants to kind of highlight that. I think that's right. Does that kind of answer a little bit?
Sure. I'm struck by the role of gender in hierarchy, how powerful it can be when we hear women brought to the center.
Yeah.
Or, I think it's war. I mean, this sort of blind patriotism and all the drawing on the neoliberal
Yeah.
institutions
Yeah.
to call that God's blessing.
Yeah. Yeah. So on the question of gender, right? Like, and this wasn't explicit. I didn't draw this out a lot in this particular iteration here, but I work on an 18th century figure named Phyllis Wheatley. She's a Black religious writer in the early period, who's often regarded for being the first African-American woman to publish a book, but she's not seen in the kind of broader historiographic canon of either Black religious thought or American religious thought more broadly as a kind of legitimate theological thinker, right? I think those are gender dynamics at play. Those are realities surrounding her social location as an enslaved woman in the 18th century at play. But there are reasons why she has been rendered invisible in the historiographic canon. And what I'm suggesting is that in someone like a Phyllis Wheatley, you have what we might regard as a kind of proto-Black theology. Now she's drawing on resources that are broadly Calvinistic, but she is in the 18th century at work on a project that will kind of subsume the whole of Black religious thought in later centuries, right? She begins that work early. So it's a matter of rendering visible individuals who have been made invisible because of these kinds of systems and structures that you just named. It's a matter of us being attentive to the ways in which, even how we remember the civil rights movement, kind of patriarchal reading of the movement. We know that there were particular sisters around King that made King's work and life possible. You see some of that work being done today. So it's an intervention in many ways historiographically, even as we try to reflect a more accurate understanding of the capacity and the capacity and the contribution of the whole of God's church. that is literally desperately needed in this moment, right? I cannot overstress that enough. Desperately needed in this moment. So I think it's a number of different ways that we need to highlight that and push back against those sites of invisibility. All right, how are we doing on time?
Maybe one more question.
Okay. So I'm gonna let Paul choose the last question.
Oh, there's more than one.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll do 2 questions.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So we'll go right here in the front
Okay,
first.
right here.
Yeah.
So, with all this in mind, how can we still be Christians that are involved in American politics today in the sense of like still using our American, like the rights we have as American citizens, but not tethering our religion and our politics too closely?
Yeah, I think one, just if you're looking for like a way to like test oneself, and I say this often, are you willing to critique your own side when they move in ways that are contrary to the convictions and the ethics that you hold? That's a very on the ground way to discern what you are about. Because in this moment, what's happening a lot is, depending on if it's on my side, I'm gonna downplay it. Like, you know, that ain't that bad. Like, that's not that bad. That's terrible. But I can't say that because then the other side's gonna win. If you're engaged in that already lets you know that you're off. If you're able to critique your own side just as much as you call out the other side, you are modeling something that is distinctly different from the moment. And folks don't like that. They don't. But what you're trying to infuse is a health into the system, right? Yeah, I'm on this team. I am on this team. But yet I am willing to tell Steph Curry that he shouldn't have shot that shot. I'm willing to say that. It was a bad shot, right? You have to be willing to prophetically, don't save all of your prophetic energy for the other side of the aisle, right? Point that prophetic energy back towards your own space because you're trying to serve it to be a healthier reflection of the values that you want to see in public. Is that helpful? That's just one like way to test, you know, where you're sitting. Yep.
Do you think black fugitivity is relevant outside of the U.S.? If so, what do you think that would look like?
Yeah. So on the one hand, I'm gonna stay true to my discipline and not engage in, you know, there's a number of places you can go here. But right, like in my advocacy work, you know, even in the testimony I gave on the Hill around constricting civil society spaces in sub-Saharan Africa, right? One of the things that I just wanted to reflect in that moment was a reminder of how non-governmental institutions and spaces, et cetera, non-state actors, whether those are religious communities, whether those are media, journalism communities, are important, that those spaces are kind of preserved as being free and not regulated by state power, right? Because those are the spaces where these kinds of otherwise imaginings take place. So what does it mean in a context that is distinctly different from what we're talking about here for someone to engage in a modeling of a distinctively different way of being and organizing, right? Yeah, I would say that that's applicable, right? I don't want to tease down exactly what it looks like in a particular region, but yeah, because ultimately what I'm getting at is a reflection of an otherwise way of going about doing things, right? Which I'll admit, in certain parts of the world, that can mean very real consequences for you, right? So I don't say that lightly at all. But we've historically seen examples of that, right? And you know, those who study, whose field of study is this, you can probably point to a number of examples like that, where individuals or movements of individuals have sought to try and reflect an imagining of something that is other than their kind of social condition and location, or the state that is regulating and structuring their lives. Means a variety of different things depending on what we're talking about. But yeah, I would say that it's broadly applicable. Yep.
Well, thank you, Stephen. You've given us. to, your message will become more and more important. I again want to thank you all for coming. The next CFI event is November the 16th. We will have Derek Sherman, a computer scientist, speaking on the title